Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. And this week in Module 5, we're going to talk about Aristotle and Materialism. Materialism is one of two different avenues towards philosophical knowledge. The other is idealism, which is the one we looked at last week with Plato. Now, let's be clear, although these are two paths, parallel paths, of course, that we travel through on our way to philosophy, we need to remember that there's a lot of crossover. And we know that quite often there is crossover from one to the other, and in fact the use of both materialism and idealism. But let's not get ahead of ourselves by too much. Let's first start with Aristotle's top 10 list, which we're going to take a look at in just a moment, like we did last week with Plato. Some brief background. Then we're going to take a look at some of the really sort of odd but interesting ideas that Aristotle had regarding biology. Physiognomy and human biology in particular. And from that, we'll segue into natural inequality. Both Plato and Aristotle knew that inequality was natural. What's really interesting is how they dealt with it, and we're going to take a look at that. From there, we move into philosophy and morality, and keeping in mind that if nature is unequal by its very nature, perhaps we should be careful in the choices we make in our interactions with one another, which is why morality becomes quite important. Morality has to do with choices, ethical choices we make to act in one way and not another. Then we'll wrap up the last two sections with looking at the end of the polis, the end of the city-state, because in Aristotle's lifetime, around 322, the Athenian polis eventually just collapsed. Stretched to its limits through internal and external warfare, imperialistic tendencies, heavy taxation, and just spiritual exhaustion. All these things together ended up crushing the city-state as we knew it. And of course, it came back, but it just was not the same. And then finally, we'll take a look at ethics of virtue, which is something that results from the end of the polis, but it does tie together with morality in the sense that an ethics of virtue is looking at the behavior of individuals not as they are aligned to a city-state or to some higher being, but simply through their behavior. And Aristotle offers some very interesting, provocative, and very long-lasting ideas that still are relevant to us today. So the first thing we want to do is, like we did last week with Plato, is look at our top 10 list. And so Aristotle, like Plato, absolutely foundational figures in the history of philosophy. So let's kind of break it down, roughly speaking, into those 10 things that we can remember about Aristotle and why he is such an important figure. So the first one is that, like Plato, Aristotle also came up with a very comprehensive system of Western philosophy. This one focuses more on a materialist or an empirical view of the world. In the same way as Plato created an idealistic comprehensive system, Aristotle is responsible, for an empirical materialistic view of the world as Western philosophy. Now, he, unlike Plato, has a much stronger interest in science, the physical sciences, the natural sciences, which is his second point. His views on physical science then helped to shape medieval scholars, and they then incorporated his ideas right through to the late 19th century and devised many of his ideas into formal aspects of logic. So, Aristotelian science, natural and physical sciences, laid a foundation for the development of science for a very, very long time. Now, having said that, we move on to the third point, which is his interest in metaphysics. So Plato was perhaps a more comprehensive thinker than Plato. Plato was fascinated, unduly so at times, with ideas and idealism. Aristotle was better grounded and more comprehensive in the sense that he combined the physical sciences with metaphysics. And sure enough, his metaphysics profoundly influenced theological ideas from the Middle Ages, scholastic traditions of the Catholic Church. And really, we can argue that both Plato and Aristotle provide structures, metaphors, that Christianity are to use at a later point in devising their orthodoxy, their worldviews, their religious affiliations, their views of the world. They borrow heavily from Aristotle and from Plato. So Plato's metaphysics, Aristotle's metaphysics, much like Plato's, really help to define what Christianity will be as a system. Number 4, philosophy aims at universals, which is sort of these grand ideas that we hold in our heads about the world. But Aristotle says that, no, that the universal is in things, right? What we call the essence of things, the treeness of an elm tree, the dogness of a Saint Bernard. We can see the universal in the thing itself. We don't have to think about it. We know that certain mammals that are warm-blooded, other animals are cold-blooded, all those indicators that point to the essence of a thing are in the thing itself, not somewhere else or not internally within us. So those universals that categorize and catalog a large number of things, whether they are plant, animal, or otherwise, they exist in the thing itself. The essence of something is found not in our minds necessarily, but in the thing itself that we see. Number 5, the 4 elements that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, earth, air, fire, and water, are strongly adhered to by Plato. And he proposes, in fact, a 5th element. Sounds like the movie The Fifth Element. Had nothing to do with Aristotle, just a cool title. But that 5th element, ether, is what Aristotle believed was formulated, or the essence of heavenly bodies. So each aspect of the world, each material aspect of the world, was part of some essence that we could divine and devise from looking at that thing itself. And Aristotle added an extra one, which is in relation to heavenly bodies, ether. Now, number 6 is a rather interesting one, and I wanted to break it down into something more substantial, because Aristotle looked at the world and how it comes into being and how it ebbs away. And he said the reason for anything coming into being can be attributed to 4 different types of simultaneously active causal factors. Now, these can be humanly created. These could be natural. It all depends. But Aristotle looked at the world and said, well, there are these 4 different forces, these causal factors that go into making something move from one shape or one condition into another. And the 4 are material, formal, efficient, and final. So let's briefly have a look at that, because this is a really important idea that Aristotle has, because it's part of what he calls this teleological worldview. So the first one is the material. This is the actual material out of which something is made. The material cause, for example, of a table back then would be wood. These days it could be granite, formica, could be laminate possibly. But the material is the material out of which something is made. So the material cause or the material factor of a table is its woodness. It's the fact that it's made of wood. So there it is. There's a chunk of wood. Now you're going to apply some kind of force to it. And this is what Aristotle calls the formal factor, the formal aspect. And that is the shape, the form, the arrangement of the matter. A tree could become a table, a hockey stick, a staircase. It could be anything. So that piece of wood is now shaped, formally shaped into something else. Still retains the same material, but depending on what you want to do with it, what the final cause might be, will now become the formal aspect, the form that it takes, essentially. So it's still a piece of wood, but that piece of wood can become any number of different things, formally speaking. 3 is the efficient cause, or the efficient factor. And that is that which causes the material to appear in a certain form. And so we have an artist that may take a piece of granite and sculpt a beautiful figure out of it. Or you can run a piece of wood through a lathe and create something else. It could be a shelf to make a bookshelf made out of wood. But that efficient cause could be literally anything. You could even think of natural efficient causes, wind, temperature, the tide, erosion. All these things are efficient causes that force a change in something that is either natural or something that could be humanly made. So what we're talking about here is the material in which something comes to us, the shape that we wish to give it, the way in which we create that shape, which is the efficient cause, and then finally the final cause, that final teleological purpose. So that piece of wood began as a chunk of wood and it ends up as a wooden table or a bookshelf or something else. So Aristotle was able to look at anything in the world and say, well, it is in its present form, but it can become something else. And Aristotle even looked at human beings this way. And he said, look, the final cause of human beings is to be together in a community. So our final teleological purpose as individuals is to live together, preferably in peace and harmony, but to live together in communities. So the last four, 7, 8, 9, and 10, 7, Aristotle believed that he wished to define metaphysics as the knowledge of immaterial being, or being in the highest degree of abstraction. If you remember last week, we talked about that ladder, right? We've spoken of bridges to that other to the beyond, but in the case of the symposium, Plato had given us this idea of a ladder moving up. Aristotle really thought of metaphysics in the same way. He said, look, it's knowledge about immaterial being. It is knowledge about the world, not of the world, but about the world. And as we move through these higher and higher, more abstract planes, we begin to talk about being and existence in higher degrees of abstraction, until finally we're thinking of just ideas, categories, universals. Now again, keep in mind that the universal is in the thing itself, but we can discuss the notion of dog, cat, mammal, tree. And each one of you will have a slightly different idea of what I'm talking about. I have a vision of a cat. You may have a slightly different one. But the notion that as we talk about metaphysics or speak in metaphysical terms, we are speaking in the highest degree of abstraction. We're simply talking and discussing thoughts. We're not discussing things or reality. We're simply discussing thoughts. And that is being at the highest degree of abstraction. 8, unlike Plato, Aristotle was a student of Plato's, but disagreed with him on many, many different things, many different ideas. So unlike Plato, Aristotle argued that there are no universals that are unattached to existing things, much like we had just finished saying a few moments ago, that the universal is in the thing. So Aristotle, that is, would talk about the essence of something, and Plato would say, yes, the essence is somewhere else. It's not in the thing itself. It's in our minds. But Aristotle said, no, there are no universals that are not unattached to something. When we see whatever it is in front of us that our senses are revealing to us, the universal is within it. If I say there's a Honda Civic, I'm implying car. The universal car is built right into this four-wheeled thing that is just driven by my house, with a blown-up muffler. That's what Aristotle means, that when we look at something, we see the universal already there. 9, Aristotle considered ethics to be a very practical rather than theoretical study, to become virtuous than knowing for its own sake. So to be virtuous, to act in a virtuous manner, is much better than simply talking about it or theorizing about it. At one point, we have to walk the talk, right? We have to be able to turn around and behave in a certain way. We can't be horrible people, but be talking about freedom and liberty and happiness. These things are counterintuitive. We have to also allow people to be free, allow liberty to be. So ethics for Aristotle had to be not only an idea, but even more important, a way of life. We needed to see it in action in society or in the community for us to believe that it occurred in the first place. So speaking about it theoretically is one thing, but that's not really ethics. Ethics is making those decisions in the community, making making a choice that will impact someone else for better or worse. And then finally, something I've already alluded to is Aristotle considered the city or the city-state to be a natural community, right? So that natural community is even prior to the family or to the individual. And he did, and famously at the very beginning of the Politics, he says, man is by nature a political and rational animal. Now, when he says a political animal, that doesn't mean they're fascinated by politics. Political here was part of the community. It meant something slightly different back then than it does now. So that is to be, if you want to think back to last week, when I mentioned that the Athenian society, and I'm using the word society in quotations because technically it didn't exist. We had the family as an economic unit to generate money to live and to buy things. And counter to that is the state. So the state with its laws and duties, and then the family / economics. There was nothing in between. And it isn't until about the 1700s, maybe even the 1800s, that the idea of society comes into being, that there is an actual distinction between the private family, the public realm of society, and then the state, which is law and order. But here, if we think of political, if we were to replace it with social, that's really what Aristotle is saying. He believes that we are by nature social animals. So for us to move to our higher being and be the best version of ourselves is to be social beings, virtuous social beings in particular. Okay, so those are the top 10. And we'll just take a brief look here at some of the background information to kind of situate Aristotle in this sort of trajectory that we're about to start. So, philosophy extended its scope from cosmology, right, which is the science and development of the universe, which is a rather vast subject matter. And over time, the focus really narrows down to maybe not the vastness of space, but something perhaps a little bit more closer to home, a little bit more relevant, which is ethics and politics. And ethics and politics is really something that concerned Aristotle throughout his entire life. He wrote a book called The Politics. He also wrote another book called The Nicomachean Ethics. And he did really concern himself with everyday life. He's considered perhaps a very early, again, sociologist, we'll put in quotations, because there is no sociology to speak of, but greatly concerned with communities, right? He's concerned with communities and their interactions and their relationships to ethics and behavior, to politics in the larger sense of the word. And he does this because he's not, he doesn't have his head in the clouds like Plato does, but in fact, very much down to earth. He's not an idealist purely or involved with mysticism like Pythagoras. He was a physicist, right? So first and foremost, he was a physicist, and he was really concerned with physical science, natural science, and other mental activities that really would be part of understanding human interaction on a daily basis. So there's a little bit of sociology, very, very primitive kind of psychology, right? The psychology of people, where he says that individuals wish to live together. And Aristotle doesn't waste any time in trying to sort of set aside previous ideas, because he did dismiss both the Republic and the laws in the second book of the Politics, and said, look, what we're discussing here is fanciful, right? It is a myth. It is utopian. And he says, look, Plato is trying to make a kind of society which would be more generally acceptable to our cities than the Republic, right? But he gradually comes back to the earlier constitution. And really what he's saying is Plato was trying to make a society that really was utterly unique, almost had no bearing on the world that the rest of them were living in. And here was Plato trying to force change, force historical development in a certain path. And Plato says, well, no, I mean, we need to recognize the cities as they are, right? Their original constitution. Now, he doesn't mean a constitution as if a charter of rights, but its construction, right? he gradually comes back to an earlier construction rather than constitution. So this is really what he's implying. The failure was the complete misguided and blind adherence to an idea rather than the reality of the society in which he was living. And as we mentioned last week, Plato had created this closed, authoritarian, almost totalitarian society based on geometry and other weird numerical calculations. And Aristotle said, no, this just doesn't work, right? You can't have a closed system when you're talking about a living organic entity like a community. A community lives and breathes and changes daily. It cannot be either closed or authoritarian or totalitarian. It needs to live and breathe. And so Aristotle thought that politics was one of the best ways in which to understand how that development can be understood. Now, he's not trying to control it. He's trying to understand it. So he believed that politics was an essential aspect of ethics, but he did not try to fix it into only one kind, some kind of fixed, ahistorical, eternal kind of ideal system, because that's just not what a community is. So Aristotle's politics is really much more refined and much more intuitive than Plato's, because it's an analysis of an already existing political structure. He is trying to understand Athens as it is, not what it could be, what it should be, what it might be, what it is. And that is what is remarkably different between Plato's utopian vision in the Republic and Aristotle's much more practical and down-to-earth examination of the city-state in politics. So that is basically some background and some clear differences between these two thinkers, and they're clearly there. Now, Plato was not concerned with biology, not really concerned with science in any significant kind of way, but Aristotle was. And Aristotle used biology to try to understand the world and how it functioned. And sure, he has a debt to Plato, intellectually speaking, but he set aside Plato's notions of perfect forms, especially ahistorical and timeless and eternal forms, in favor of empiricism. And what is empiricism? It's the idea that all knowledge is obtained through the senses and not inherited. Right? That's a dig at Plato, because he said that all knowledge is always already there. Right? Well, how are we going to learn anything new? Right? We're not really learning anything new. We're simply having confirmed to us that which has always been there. So it doesn't really move us forward a whole lot. But Aristotle thought, no, let's set this aside in favor of empiricism, right? Knowledge from sense experience. And we can see why Aristotle would want to look at the city-state in its present form, in its actual form. Because as an empirical thinker, you can't start looking at hypotheticals and be empirical. It just doesn't work, because you would have literally no input into your senses if you're thinking specifically in ideas and hypotheses. So what do we end up with? Well, we end up with Plato, who is an idealist, and Aristotle, who is a materialist. And so the world of experience is really what we need for us to understand, and we need to experience the world in order to not only understand it, but to be able to experience it in a way that we can now begin to catalog what that world actually is, what it actually consists of. Not what it could, should, might consist of, or will. No, what is happening right in front of us. And he writes in Generation and Destruction, those who indulge in long discussions rendered unobservant of facts, another dig at Plato, are too ready to dogmatize from few observations. So there's very succinct, but a clear dig and a clear attack on Plato and Platonists and idealists, right? Those who indulge in long discussions rendered unobservant of fact. In other words, they're lost in the clouds. They literally have to be poked with a stick periodically to be reminded, oh, you're still on planet Earth, by the way. And this is what is happening. Aristotle says that is what these people tend to do. They'll just run with ideas and just slavishly go after the idea and not observe. not experience. And you can't start to dogmatize and create a kind of orthodoxy when you have nothing to base it on other than ideas. So biology and physics becomes of absolutely paramount importance to Aristotle. Now, what is unusual, because again, we're just starting out here, these sciences are in their infancy. When we talk about biology, nature, right, as it existed in the family, sexuality, for example, is not addressed at all in Aristotle's writings. And of course, in particular, in his political writings, because it's kind of little understood. Not much is understood into the true nature of the family, the true nature of sexuality. Because remember, on the one hand, we have the family as an economic unit. So economics is paramount, more so than interrelationships. So to talk about the biology of a family really is not a subject that is understood very well at that particular point, because it is an economic unit, not a biological unit, or at least viewed that way. So we have two things that are going on. We have the notion of class, right? Because both Aristotle and Plato were aristocratic, and their aristocratic background meant that they never really engaged with daily life. Everything would be relegated to slaves or to wives and children to do. And these individuals would just, still sit and think. Now, Aristotle seemed to keep his feet firmly on the ground, which makes him a slightly more approachable person than, say, Plato. If we were to meet these two around the water cooler, probably we'd have a better time with Aristotle than we would with Plato. So there is the notion of class. And class really is antithetical to notions of the family and sexuality. And the other one, too, is sex and fertility itself. Both of them were an absolute mystery to philosophers. Aristotle famously wrote in the Politics, I believe, where he talks about the fact that a woman is merely a vessel for the male sperm and has no influence whatsoever on the child. Its development, its genetic makeup, clearly wrong. Absolutely wrong. So I'm not saying that Aristotle is a genius and said things that have lasted forever and are correct. But they started somewhere, right? They started somewhere. But one of the things that they did not look at was the biology of the family, psychological and interpersonal relationships, and sexuality in general. They just didn't understand it. Now, on the other hand, there were some contributions that Aristotle did give to biology, and he did occupy a fair amount of his work, and just interesting ideas. But really what is most remarkable with Aristotle's work is that all of this research never led to empirical research and then into practical applications. And so it was basically science for science's sake, or philosophy for philosophy's sake. It was never applied in any practical way. And even though Aristotle is working in, biology, he never thought to apply to animal breeding, plant farming, farming in general. It's almost as if Aristotle, perhaps as much as Plato, was simply satisfied by understanding something, right? Figuring out how something works, how something comes into being or ebbs away. And that was really kind of all he did. Now, that's not actually completely true. What did happen is these ideas, right, that intellectual interest in biology kind of seeped into his political thinking. And that's what I want to look at next. And this is where we find this idea of natural inequality. This is something that is there in book 1 of the Politics. It can be difficult to read through, especially in 2022, but we need to at least try to understand how Aristotle came to these conclusions. And so we see in Politics, as you can see as the name implies, it is looking at political structures, which were there, more so than social structures, which were essentially non-existent. But in the Politics, Aristotle talks about communities. And he talks about communities of like-minded individuals. And what he does is he applies what he learned in biology, and those ideas, those metaphors, those rules, those standards, and he applies it to the community. And he says, for example, that there must be a union of those who cannot exist without each other. This is one of the positive aspects of communities, is in each individual has a particular strength or a weakness, but together we each can pool those resources and pool those strengths and make all of us, all of the members of that community that much better. So when he talks this way, he looks at how biology works in the same way, is like attracts like, and there's a union of individuals that may have strengths and weaknesses, and they kind of gravitate to each other. And what Aristotle does is he applies that biological paradigm to the unity of man and woman. All right, and he says man and woman must unite for the necessity of procreation. It cannot happen any other way. And he says that union is a relationship of biological preservation. And it's true. In order to procreate, man and woman need to come together. Now, this is well before artificial insemination and everything else that has occurred over the last, say, 50 years. This is, again, around 300 BC. So bear with us here. So Aristotle says the union of a man and a woman is a relationship of biological preservation. It isn't just preservation of the community, but it's biological. That's what it's based on. Now, here's where it gets interesting and problematic, because Aristotle doesn't qualify this biological relationship as equal or establish a binary opposition between masculinity and femininity. And in fact, he calls it masculine superiority and female inferiority. So within this context of this biological paradigm, he says there must be a union of that which by nature can rule and that which by nature should be ruled for the sake of their preservation. So what does this mean? What this means is seeped into or hidden behind political ideas about the community is this biological paradigm that tries to present what is unequal as natural. So what Aristotle is trying to convince us of, that natural masculine superiority and female inferiority is not only necessary, but natural. Now, unequal dispositions in a community were certainly there and were acknowledged. But what is happening here is that unequality or inequality is presented to us as natural because it is using a biological paradigm. This is the point I'm trying to make here. So, from this position of natural inequality being presented as natural and good, Aristotle shifts from this biological to an essentialist argument regarding social organization. And he says, he who can reason is a ruler, and he who cannot is ruled over. And what brings us about is, again, ananke, right? Necessity. So there is the person who can rule and the person who cannot. And if they cannot, they should be ruled over. And this should be not only necessary, but natural. That's essentially what he's saying. And he says that the male master naturally, quote unquote, naturally possesses superior intelligence over the female, quite often a female slave. Because what would often happen during these imperial missions on behalf of Athens, although other city-states did the same thing, they would raid a village, they would round up everyone, they would kill all the men and behead them, and enslave the women and children. So this is the world in which Aristotle and Plato are living. Let's never forget that, because it was a slave state. So Aristotle argues that there's somehow something natural about that inequality. So something unequal is naturally so because it is necessarily so. And what Aristotle ultimately is doing is he's not giving us history, but rather a biological justification for what we now call gender politics. That all of this interaction, these unequal relationships, are somehow both natural and necessary. So that is the point I'm trying to make here. So if this is happening within the household of the ruler and the ruled, that single household now moves to a village or a community. And again, this teleological development, what we talked about at the beginning, right? The final cause, the final form of something. The teleological development of the human being leads logically to the polis, right, as the most ideal kind of formation. But it is a formation that is still built upon the backs of those who are unequal, and basically the backs of women and slaves. And those individuals are the foundation of the city-state. And the city-state is built upon the backs of those who are silenced, or those that have no vote because they're not land-owning males. And these are individuals who are basically creating the world that is now built somehow by necessity because they are unequal. So it's harsh. As much as I really enjoy Aristotle, these are passages that are very difficult to read through and digest, but we have to at least understand why he's thinking this way. And he's doing it all because of ananke, because of necessity. Inequality is necessary, is what he's saying, for society to work. And so his views of nature are unusual, to say the least, because what he's trying to do is apply this notion of this universal category to all of humanity, when in fact it is only applied to males. The notion that the final form of someone, right, where he's talking about men, they are the only ones that can reach that final form. Because for Aristotle, once a slave, always a slave. Once a female, always a female. And so only men reserve the right to continually develop themselves and become better versions of themselves. So again, pretty harsh. Now, the financial operations of a household, and again, this is what really matters for the family. It's not interrelationships between husband and wife, or between parents and children, or children themselves. This is not even on the radar. Absolutely non-existent. The family is a series of financial operations, and they basically are concerned with the acquisition of property. And of course, property includes slaves. And all of this, the imperatives of these operations, are both natural and necessary. In fact, they're presented this way. They're presented as both natural and necessary as part of household management. And of course, the slave is one of many different tools that are used in the final version, right? The best version of this household management. So he writes in Book 1 of the Politics, "From the above description and the nature and capacity of a slave are now clear. A slave by nature is an individual who, being a man, if they're lucky to not be beheaded, by his nature not his own, but belongs to another, if, being a man, he is a thing possessed." And so again, there's biological paradigm of the essential being or the essential aspects of a human being. What Aristotle is trying to do is kind of shoehorn a biological paradigm into the everyday reality of the family and the community, and says the capacity of a slave can now be understood. A slave is by nature an individual who, by his nature, is not his own, but belongs to another. In other words, they are naturally disposed to belong to other people. So they are naturally predisposed to be enslaved, ? Let's think for a moment how slaves are created. They're captured. There is a raiding party, some imperialist conquest or imperial conquest, and it's a raiding party. And one day someone is a farmer, the next day they're enslaved. And if they're not beheaded then and there, they're captured. So how can a slave be naturally predisposed to slavery when a few days prior they were doing something entirely different? Yet here is Aristotle saying, well, you know, we talk about the teleological endpoint of someone. That's what they're meant to be. Again, very difficult to fathom, but there it is. So he goes on. Nature, quote, "Nature, as we say, does nothing without some purpose, and for the purpose of making man a political animal, she has endowed him among the animals with the power of reasoned speech." Okay, so we have individuals who are naturally predisposed to be slaves. That is their teleological final version of themselves, because once a slave, always a slave. Although there were still times when a slave could buy their freedom, and it did occur. If you were manumitted, that's the word. Manumission is the freeing of a slave, and it did happen. And so even that reality is counterproductive to what Aristotle is trying to argue here, saying that somehow we are naturally predisposed to be enslaved by another, or at least some people are. Okay, and how does that work when, last week this guy was a farmer and now is a slave? Now, here's where it becomes even more critical and problematic. Aristotle argues that nature does nothing without some purpose, right? Some necessary purpose. And what we are given by way of a gift is the power of reasoned speech. So, according to Aristotle, all individuals using reasoned speech can create that linguistic community, can speak to one another, can grasp abstract thoughts using language. So we're not brute animals, right? Slaves are not brute animals. They're human beings. And Aristotle gives the capacity for speech and thought to all human beings. And individuals, in this case men, have always used reasoned speech to coordinate relationships with women and slaves into an economic household in order to secure property and wealth. And this is really the only way in which a society can develop, right? Through linguistic interaction, people speaking to one another, announcing to each other their wants and needs, and all the different goods and services that are available in that ancient community are coordinated through speech. So, Aristotle also points out that a natural relationship is in fact the only one that is possible, because individuals, again, cannot exist without each other. So, to be a human being unto yourself is virtually impossible, right? According to Aristotle, because your strength may be one thing, but your weaknesses may eventually kill you. You need to live with other people. So you do it by speaking to others. And so reasoned speech is necessary. And remember, reasoned speech is something that is available to all individuals, including slaves and women and children. So reasoned speech is necessary to maintain that linguistic community, no matter the nature of individual social roles. And of course, here comes the crux, right? Here's the paradox. So all individuals who participate in this community all have the capacity for reasoned speech. Yet women and slaves are somehow denied this capacity. So the notion that everyone has reasoned speech is very problematic, because somehow women and slaves are denied this possibility, denied this capacity, and of course is further reinforced by the fact that even the legal category of person, they're not even considered persons. Now, obviously they are individuals, but the legal category of a person who can sue another person, a person that can participate in discussions to repeal certain laws or bring other laws into being. They don't have that. And so we have this very strange paradoxical relationship between essential being, natural being, inequality, reasoned speech, all of these interacting, and ultimately they're all part of these social relations that Aristotle says are very important, because they are part of what makes a community not only come into being, but continue to exist. But ultimately, that community is based on this flawed biological model. He tries to argue that women and slaves are biologically predisposed to be ruled over. And we don't know that, because we never knew if women had any opportunities to become other than simply childbearers. And slaves, we knew at some point were doing something else before they were enslaved. So clearly that's not their essential being, is it? Now, once they get into the Athenian community, they're denied those rights and they are essentially silenced. And if you cannot talk back and push back against the way the community sees you, then yes, inequality is absolutely fulfilled there. And so if slaves, because they are individuals that were living in other communities, they have the capacity for reasoned speech, they should, according to Aristotle, have the capacity for self-consciousness. And they have to. Otherwise, a slave would be unable to function as a slave. And if you were to buy a slave in the market and have the inability for self-consciousness, that slave would not be very useful, would they? They couldn't do anything. You couldn't instruct them. You couldn't give them suggestions. You couldn't ask them to go down to the market and pick up something. They just wander off. And clearly that's not the case. Slaves were human beings, or still are human beings, but they were more than that somewhere else. Once they entered into that Athenian community, they now fall under the sway of this weird biological paradigm that says that the ruled and the ruler somehow are biologically necessary because that's simply the only way the community can function. And really, if you ask yourself if a slave had even a modicum of intelligence, they should still be able to participate in rational speech and self-consciousness. And so this is really where Aristotle comes up with a very bizarre idea. He tries to disguise that economic imperative, right, financial operation, as somehow natural and biological, because financial operations really need a ruler and a ruled, because there needs to be slavery for the economic system to function. And no matter what, slavery is not a matter of a given situation, but something that is forced to be so through cultural convention. Slaves are necessary for the economy to run, and the only way in which they can be necessary is to create a system where they are designed as such that they are part of the system. They are necessarily part of the system. And clearly we know that's not true, but Aristotle tries to make us believe that by using biology. And ultimately, it becomes a kind of cultural contradiction, right? And it's necessary to maintain domestic production, economic wealth, because without it, we no longer have an economy that functions, because we have individuals that can speak up and push back and say, no, I don't want to do this. But we also are going to threaten that leisure activity, right? That the intellectuals who are aristocrats, landowning males, they no longer have that leisure activity because they don't have slaves to do the work for them anymore. So anyone that's in a position of power is, of course, going to argue that all of this is necessary. And not only is it necessary, it's natural. It's natural to enslave another. It's natural to rule over someone else. So harsh words, harsh ideas, even from someone like Aristotle. So now from that, we move to philosophy of morality. Things start looking a little bit better at this point. Now, Aristotle, his view of the state isn't just a description, but he classifies, he recommends periodically, he judges. But if he does, he always aims at what is possible. He's not going to completely unearth and upend the society. And he will talk about what is desirable, but he never comes through and says, we need a revolution. We need to turn this upside down. We need to move this in a different direction. That's Plato. Now, Plato is not typically considered a revolutionary, but had he been given the opportunity to enact his idea of a republic, that would have been an utterly different worldview, and that would have been brought about through revolutionary change. And so here Aristotle is looking at the state. He describes it, classifies it, recommends certain ideas to make it better, but that's really as far as it goes. And so he says, look, if we make one group of individuals permanent rulers, we're going to invite civil strife, right? We're going to invite stasis. We need to make sure that there is a degree of happiness across the whole, right? We need to have a happy community. Now remember, right, a happy community that does not include slaves, women, migrant workers who have no voice. They're not considered persons. So when Aristotle is talking about happiness, he's talking about those individuals who have personhood, right? They're typically landowning males or aristocrats, or at least wealthy people. So let's take a look at the following quote here. Every state exists by nature, right? Naturally, people want to come together. If indeed the first associations too existed by nature, in other words, groups of families, for the latter association have the latter as their end. And nature is the end of becoming. Besides, the final cause or the end is the best, and the self-sufficiency of an association is the end and the best. From the above remark, then, it is evident that a state exists by nature and that man is by nature a political animal. So, a state or a community, we'll say, because again, a state is not, let's say, all of Greece. It is a city-state. So a city-state or a polis exists naturally because people come together originally in families as economic units, and then a group of families as economic units come together, and they keep moving sort of into a wider network of families and communities. And this is really the end point of all of this. It has to be an association. And the final cause of all of this is the self-sufficiency of that city-state. So it isn't relying on outside sources. It doesn't need to import any of its goods and services. It can be self-sufficient. And that, for Aristotle, is that teleological endpoint. That final point, the final form of a community, is its ability to be self-sufficient. And this is why Aristotle says that the first thing that we need to recognize is the fact that it exists naturally because it's something we want. And because of that, we, by our very nature, are political, or let's say social animals. We want to be around people. So that is really a complex and coherent argument that really helps to explain why communities and bringing people together is so important, because it ties together a number of different ideas. First of all, Aristotle's concept of nature as having a degree of necessity, degree of inequality, right? That's naturally what is going on. It's also his doctrine of the golden mean, and we'll talk about that very soon. The golden mean it's a midway point between an extreme or an excess and a deficiency. So we'll leave it like that for now, but it is that middle point between these two extremes. And that middle point, the middle point is really virtue, right? To be in the middle, not to be too much or not enough of something, to be in that golden mean is to be a virtuous person. So we'll look at that shortly. Number 3, his ethics, right? So we've got his concept of nature, his notion of virtue, his ethics, and finally 4, systematically developed notion of justice, community, virtue, and the good life, all tied together in one complex yet coherent argument in favor of the community. Now, as Aristotle is working on this, he's trying to come up with a good community, one that is functional. Well, guess what? By 322, in his own lifetime, the classical polis dies. And it completely throws into question all these ideas that Aristotle had been thinking about, because really without the city-state upon which we can place these ideas, because it is the foundation, right, the necessary foundation, the concepts now become somewhat meaningless. And so what Aristotle does is he tries to figure out a new way to understand how people interact with one another. What makes a good citizen? Perhaps the first time around we put the cart in front of the horse, right? The cart being the society and the horse being people. Why don't we maybe do it the other way around, which is perhaps more normal, natural, and necessary, and say, let's create good citizens, and those good citizens will then create a good community. There was such a focus on creating the structure that both thinkers, both Plato and Aristotle, kind of lost sight of the individuals that make up that community, as much as Aristotle certainly went much further than Plato. So his logic and physics, very important, but it became less important to his politics and his ethics because they were no longer necessary. With the end of the polis, we're now talking about human behavior. We're not talking about community structures and economic units and so on and how they all work together, because at this point they have failed. So his logic and physics remains vital, right? But his politics and ethics, because they were kind of the practical arts, right? That which brings together the polis and allows it to function. So Aristotle, in the second half of his life, really has a crisis on his hands, because the polis is no longer there as that defining feature of what makes a human being, really willing to either lay down their life because they love the city-state. What is my main purpose? Because yes, I was told by Aristotle that I live in a community, but where's my community? So with the end of the polis, things become more personal, more private. And morality, private morality, becomes now more important. And all of a sudden, the family, which has been looked at as an economic unit, now is looked at as something else, perhaps a unit of interaction. So the role of the family as an economic unit was certainly important, but without that institution called the city-state or the polis, it begins to take on new characteristics. So the primary role of the family was without doubt, it was an economic unit, since it was the primary institution around which most of life was organized, but that city life is no longer there. And so the desire now is to try to figure out how to instill in individuals a new kind of moral code that was separate from the moral code that was given to us by the polis. It had to come from within. That's really what he's trying to say. So there was, yes, some degree of pessimism, a degree of doubt and cynicism, rather than trying to come up with a workable solution. But here's where thinking on your feet and thinking on the ground eventually won the day. Because prior to that, we have mathematicians and astronomers and metaphysicians who really had no idea what was going on. They had a certainly long life ahead of them because they didn't have to worry about the city-state anymore. It didn't exist. So, comparatively speaking, mathematicians and astronomers and metaphysicians really were suddenly unhinged, right? They were now set free from having to worry about the polis because it didn't exist. But the others, the materialists and the empiricists, like Aristotle, they were trying to still maintain some degree of contact with the physical world. Yet, at that time, the tendency was to move away from that physical world. So Aristotle is kind of at odds with the tendency of philosophy at this point to become increasingly metaphysical, increasingly sort of mathematical, because it was a way to kind of overcome the pessimism and doubt and cynicism that had now begun to creep into philosophy. And so if you were an empiricist and a materialist, you didn't have much to work on, right? But if you were a mathematician or a metaphysician and you didn't have to worry about the city-state anymore, the sky's the limit. You could literally talk about anything. And so what it was a kind of flight from reality. And so it was a flight from physical reality. And the end result was because the polis had essentially disappeared and fallen apart, there had to be a completely new rethinking of what this polis might look like in the future and what it needed to work, right? What did it need to make it come back to life like the way it was, and perhaps even better? So the polis was perhaps an experiment that was unworkable and could not sustain its members. There were all kinds of reasons, constant fighting, the taxation system. They ran out of money. They were attacked from without, and yet there were still this imperial force, a whole range of things. The Peloponnesian War destroyed them. And so when the polis proved unworkable, right, when it couldn't sustain its members, even with a minimum standard of living, all the pleas for moral renewal were simply ignored. But Aristotle did not give up. So he wanted to figure out just how to make a better person. So no system of internal arrangement within the polis could have saved its way of life. It didn't matter what anybody was going to present. Too many of these ideas were metaphysical, right? They were unhinged from reality. They were not dealing with the day-to-day issues. And the only person that could really provide some way out of this cynical dead end was someone like Aristotle, because he did have at least a degree of empiricism in his political ideals. And so they weren't ideas with a capital I that were sort of beyond reality and beyond in some timeless world. No, what he did was try to search for something that might be possible rather than ideal. And even if it was a failure, there was still an attempt. Now, as it turns out, it was not a complete failure. In fact, what he presented to us, right, to the world in 349 was his Nicomachean ethics. And this is something that really is a remarkable text because it presents a way of living that is applicable literally anywhere. And he says, for anyone, the good of a man, not a woman, slave, or child, of course, therein lies the problem, but still, let's bear with it. So the good of a man is the activity of the soul in conformity with virtues such as courage, generosity, or self-control. So the central question of what makes a good individual, a good social individual, is this notion of virtues. And those virtues align themselves with courage, generosity, and self-control, and they're traits that a person would have that makes them a good individual, that makes them someone you would want to be around. So what is a virtue? Aristotle writes that a virtue, and this is basically sort of a working definition, it is a commendable trait, right? A good trait, a commendable trait of character manifested in habitual action and is good for men to have. Okay, couple things that are going on here. One, it's commendable. It's something that you would like to have yourself and would certainly hope others have it too. And the second one, equally important, is that it is manifested in habitual action. We're not courageous sometimes. We're courageous all the time. We're kind all the time. We have a degree of self-control all the time. So it is habitual action in the sense that we behave this way in a consistent manner. And not only that, but others recognize those virtues as consistent because they are simply who we are. So our essence is to be courageous or wise or having a degree of self-control. So it is something that is that midpoint, right? Let's say the word courage. The excess of courage would be recklessness, right? To walk into a dangerous situation without even thinking about it and assessing it. Or the opposite, right? A deficiency of courage is cowardice. So courage is that midpoint, right? That golden mean, that balance between an excess and a deficiency. And that midpoint, there's a whole range of them. So in the middle between rashness and cowardice would be courage. And between extravagance or stinginess would be generosity. And on and on. So if you look in the center here, the balance, those are virtues. Courage, generosity, ambition, modesty, honesty, good humor, friendship. All of these are qualities that we would like to have ourselves, and we would certainly like others to have them as well. So it's a midpoint between two extremes. It is a means by reference to two vices, right? Two extremes of one sort or another, an excess or deficiency. And something else is going on. And this is where Aristotle's notion of, putting the horse in front of the cart for perhaps the first time, the horse being the person, all right, that perhaps virtues like honesty are necessary, right? They are necessary for communities to function. Because if people engage in lying to one another constantly, well, you could have all the reasoned speech in the world. No one's going to believe you, right? You're not going to be believed because you are known as someone who lies. And you fudge the truth and you always present yourself in the best light possible. All kinds of things can go wrong if people are not honest. And we realize that perhaps society is based on many of these qualities. Maybe not courage in the sense that thankfully we are so lucky not to be at war constantly. So courage may look slightly different. We may have the courage to go and help someone. Let's say someone in a big city that, falls into a subway line or off the platform, and someone is courageous enough to jump down and get them out and, before the subway shows up. That's still courage, but it's not courage in a kind of warlike setting. But each one of these, generosity, modesty, honesty, friendship, all of those virtues help to create a good society. But what they do is they create a good person. Now, that's why these virtues are important, because they not only are important character traits that are good for people to have, but the community needs them. And so no matter which community you're in, and this is where the disconnect between the city-state of Athens versus these virtues can exist anywhere at any time. And that's what makes them so useful. So they are important character traits that are good for people to have. And they're also good for different reasons, because a virtuous person, ultimately, no matter which ones they are, that person will likely just do better in society. They may have more friends, people that like to be around them because they are temperate or wise or generous or whatever it is. But ultimately, these virtues like honesty, friendship, self-control are important for that community to begin to develop with other like-minded virtuous individuals. And this is where Aristotle was able to sort of work through the cynicism and sort of, depression of the city-state of Athens dissolving away. He set about trying to figure out not a better city, but perhaps a better citizen, right? A better person. So, for Aristotle, a human being is a social creature that wishes to live with other people. That's their teleological endpoint. We like to live in communities because we grow up in families, we have friends and acquaintances, we eventually move into a neighborhood or into a city, and we interact with people. And the way in which we interact in a positive way is to have virtues like loyalty, fairness, and honesty, because they are necessary. For us to successfully interact with one another, we should at least have some of these qualities, because whether we want to gain employment or we want to have friends, we need to have some of those qualities. And they are basically qualities for good living, successful living. So it depends on where you live, and it depends how you define courage and temperance and so on, like such as the example I just gave you. But we need to remember that certain virtues will be needed by some people at certain times, but all people at all times. It just depends what they are. And this is what really makes Aristotle's ideas so remarkable, is an ethics of virtue is usable anywhere in the world at any point in time. So societies, ancient and modern, have the same problems, they have the same needs, and we need people who are courageous, generous, honest, and engaged in friendships. So that's Aristotle. We started off in kind of a dark place with slavery, but he redeemed himself and said that at the end of the day, we can still be decent people. So that's Aristotle and his materialist view of the world, his empirical view, and yes, his biological paradigm. When he did apply it, he perhaps applied it to the wrong thing, because communities may be organic, but they're not biological in the sense that he described it. So that's basically Aristotle and his materialist way of viewing the world. And that's the end of these slides, and we'll see you again next week for more of this. Take care. See you soon.